Good afternoon and welcome everyone to this virtual event on the geopolitical implications of COVID-19, hosted by the Atlantic Council Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security in collaboration with the Swedish American Chambers of Commerce, SACC-USA. This is the second event in collaboration between the Scowcroft Center and SACC-USA. The first one, which we hosted on April 30, featured a conversation between myself and the Swedish ambassador Karin Olofsdotter on the Swedish-American cooperation in the era of COVID-19. Today, we are excited to expand upon that topic by focusing more broadly upon the geopolitics of the pandemic, and accordingly, we will hear from Scowcroft Center's Director Barry Pavel on how we can build a strategy to shape the US and allied response. My name is Michael Anderson. I am a board director at the Council, as well as an executive at Saab and as chairman of SACC-USA. We are just beginning to comprehend the sweeping long-term impacts of the coronavirus. In response, governments around the world have mobilized substantial resources to protect health, economic vitality, and security of their societies. The task often begins at home. Success in this time of crisis demands that we restore faith in public institutions and in the very essence of democracy. But this does not mean that any one nation can confront this pandemic alone, or what we can afford to ignore its broader international implications over time. Indeed, as former statesman and fellow Atlantic Council board director Henry Kissinger reminded us, the crisis effort, however vast and necessary, must not crowd out the urgent task of launching a parallel enterprise for the transition to the post-coronavirus world order. Thus, it's essential to understand the geopolitical implications of this pandemic, while using that to better shape our strategic approach over time. The current world order is under threat. Many may never be the same. Indeed, the pandemic has created or amplified a number of difficult geopolitical challenges. For example, as former Swedish Defense Minister Björn von Sydow recently argued, the virus has weakened European institutions and solidarity, thereby making it more vulnerable to the revisionism of great power competitors like Russia and China. In fact, in the face of such challenges, multilateral alliances and partnerships are crucial to building a stronger and more secure world in the wake of the pandemic. In that spirit, as both a board director of the Atlantic Council and the chairman of SACC-USA, I can personally attest to these organizations' shared commitment to leveraging alliances and partnerships for a better world order, especially as we confront this pandemic. SACC-USA's mission is to serve as a key facilitator in the development of trade relations and investment opportunities between the United States and Sweden, which is crucial for mitigating the adverse economic effects on the virus. Meanwhile, the Council Scowcroft Center works to develop sustainable, nonpartisan strategies to address the most important security challenges facing the US and the world, such as COVID-19. Specifically, it seeks to do so by helping the United States to work extremely close with its allies and partners, thereby honoring General Brent Scowcroft's legendary career and commitment to friends abroad. Naturally, the Scowcroft Center has begun to conduct a robust body of work to address the current crisis and shape its long-term outcomes. Thus, I would like to introduce Barry Pavel, who will address the Scowcroft Center's effort to both comprehend the geopolitics of COVID-19 and shape the US and allied response, including forecasting alternate scenarios and building a strategy for strengthening the world order. Barry Pavel is the Senior Vice President at the Atlantic Council and the Director of its Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security. Prior to joining the Council, he was a career member of the Senior Executive Service in the Pentagon's Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for almost 18 years. From 2008 to 2010, he served as the Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Defense Policy and Strategy on the National Security Council staff. There, he contributed to and oversaw a variety of crucial policy documents, such as the 2010 National Security Strategy, the Quadrennial Defense Review, the Nuclear Posture Review, the Ballistic Missile Defense Review, and the Space Posture Review. Barry is a true authority in his field, and we look forward to hear your keynotes today. Over to you, Barry. Sorry, I have one housekeeping matter before I let you go, Barry. I'd like to remind everyone that this event is public and on the record. We encourage the audience on Zoom to ask questions for Barry and myself in the Q&A tab, which you can see at the bottom of your screen. We will be monitoring and collecting these questions, and we will answer some of them at the end of the event. Since this is a public event, please be sure to identify your name and affiliation with each question you submit. We also encourage our audience to join the discussion on Twitter using hashtag #ACCoronavirus. Once again, I'd like to thank all of you for being with us for what I know will be an important conversation on the geopolitical implications of COVID-19. Now over to you, Barry.
Well, thanks so much, Mike, and good afternoon, everyone, including our friends overseas. It's great to see all of you. I'll just outline my thoughts and really look forward to your thoughts, because this is a very much an unfolding crisis. About 650 years ago, several ships arrived in an Italian port. When it got in there, it was realized that almost all of the sailors were dead, and the rest were stricken with a gruesome ailment. 5 years after this ship's arrival, 1/3 of Europe's population lay dead from the bubonic plague. Hundreds of millions died around the world. Less than a millennium removed from the fall of Rome, the plague left Europe and the world once again dramatically altered. But just a century later, the period that historians have long since labeled the Renaissance began to pick up steam, as Europe experienced a revitalization of arts, literature, culture, sciences, and much more. Rapid geopolitical transformations also were underway, with the stage set for the rise of the nation state, which is the basic building block of the global system that we still are operating with today. And so out of the ashes of enormous death, Europe experienced a revival. Let's consider more recent history. About 100 years ago, the US Senate took up a momentous vote on ratification of the Treaty of Versailles and approval of a new League of Nations. At that time, Nebraska Senator William Borah argued that by accepting the treaty, the US would, quote, have forfeited and surrendered once and for all the great policy of no entangling alliances upon which the strength of this republic has been founded for 150 years, unquote. One wonders what Senator Borah would have said if he witnessed what happened a quarter century later, as in 1945, representatives from 50 nations met in San Francisco to formally establish the United Nations. In July of that year, the same Senate body that had voted against the League of Nations 25 years earlier elected to ratify the UN Charter with an overwhelming majority. The point of mentioning these anecdotes is this: we are going through a terrible global crisis, but one way to think about how we develop a strategy to address it and its aftermath is to keep a keen eye on where do we want to be after this? What is the opportunity that we can build coming out of this? The Renaissance emerged out of the Black Death, and the unprecedented 70+ years of peace and prosperity after World War II of the rules-based international system followed decades of war and economic depression. So today we face a strategic shock and a threat to the global system that the world really hasn't seen since World War II. That's my view. The coronavirus emerged suddenly and is spreading rapidly, miring the world in a pandemic that could upend the post-war system that we have enjoyed. Even now, it is stunning to me how little we know about this virus. Let me give you a couple of examples. Yesterday's news alone featured a new outbreak in Wuhan, China, which is the most monitored and locked down place on Earth. Second, there was also a story from Los Angeles about a woman who previously was hospitalized with the virus. She then recovered. She tested negative. She was released. This week, unfortunately, she tested positive again, and she is back in the same hospital. So, as the virus itself is the core strategic shock here, and it's already generating other shocks, what I call secondary and tertiary strategic shocks, such as the possibility of an economic depression. The main point here is that as the virus goes, so goes geopolitics. So there is an enormous amount of uncertainty about what we're dealing with yet, what it means, how long it will be with us, how do we deal with it. Almost every question about it is still up for grabs. So the challenge before us is this: we are facing an inflection point in history akin to what was encountered by the world in 1919 and 1945. Decisions then in each of those time periods was made by leaders, and those decisions created drastically different worlds. One set of decisions by leaders led to a worse war, a world war again, which was worse than the first one. The other led to more than 70 years of unprecedented freedom, prosperity, and peace, with 400 million people coming from the lower class into the middle class, and a lot more. At the Atlantic Council, we are committed to making this a 1945 moment and to help offer leaders the ideas for strategy and policies to shape what we're doing now, but also the post-pandemic world, so that it's better for all of us, for the entire world. So during this time at the Scowcroft Center, we're leaning pretty heavily on a couple of our unique skill sets, relatively unique skill sets, and those are strategic foresight and scenario planning, and strategy development. So if you look on our website, which I strongly commend, we've started a new paper series called Shaping the Post-COVID-19 World Together. The first Atlantic Council strategy paper in that series is already up, and that is by Dr. Matt Burrows, who used to do the long-range trends for the CIA, and Dr. Peter Engelke, and that paper is called What World Post-COVID-19? It outlines scenarios for where the global order might be headed. I'm going to borrow from them. I have 4 scenarios that I think it's worth thinking about, and then you use those to try to figure out, well, how can we best prepare for some combination of those outcomes. Scenario 1, accelerator downwards. In this scenario, great power competition, in particular between the US and China, is exacerbated. The US, Europe, China, and the rest of Asia struggle with a series of secondary and tertiary shocks: economic, political, security, health. The US decides to try to use this moment to rally its allies to systematically and assertively confront China and seek to redress the global balance of power. This appears to me to be the current administration's strategy, which has focused much of its diplomacy recently on China's culpability and threatening significant retaliation for China's mismanagement, for its inability to prevent the consequences in an effective fashion from spilling out into the world. This is indeed the second pandemic in 20 years that has emerged from China. Scenario 2, China first. In this scenario, China exploits the crisis to further fill the leadership vacuum and undermine the Western-led democratic world system. A shift in the global balance of power occurs as whatever was left of what used to be called America's unipolar moment ends. China asserts itself as a rival of equal or even greater power. Although this world is fragmented, the West is brought closer together. The US and Europe are brought closer together to balance against the challenge posed by an authoritarian system that is antithetical to our values. The third scenario is what I call China last. And here you cannot preclude the possibility, despite Chinese propaganda, that China could suffer much more than the Democrats. There could be significant new outbreaks of the virus. There could be significant unrest in China. There could be important hits to China's economy, and in some ways, a breaking of that leadership's social contract with its people. In some sense, we have already witnessed China struggling to assert itself diplomatically in this period, with a lot of countries upset by them, faulty equipment delivered for medical purposes, fiery statements of China's diplomats, which are now being called wolf warriors, based on a movie. And I know this happened in Sweden recently too, among many other places. And China's soft power is also suffering in Africa. If China's economy remains stalled for an extended period of time, this could further reduce its global standing and curb its rise as a great power. This might also, unfortunately, cause the Chinese Communist Party, which rules the country, to lash out internationally to distract from its failures. There is a fourth scenario, and we call this recovery and rejuvenation. And as you might imagine, this is a scenario where the US works very closely with its European allies and partners, Japan, Korea, Australia, Taiwan, other like-minded countries, to lead a recovery and a rejuvenation of a new adapted rules-based international system. And achieving this scenario requires deep, sustained, close US cooperation with allies, and also ideally with China too, because China has a stake in a stable, strong, rules-based system. The Atlantic Council and the Scowcroft Center that I run there has taken as our mission to help US and other leaders drive the world as much as we can toward this scenario. We firmly believe that a rules-based system of some sort, especially if it's undergirded by our shared values, is really essential. There were so many benefits of the post-World War II system. Conflict-related deaths declined significantly, per capita GDP soared, poverty nosedived, and the world has never been wealthier. Democracy also advanced all over the world, and despite the headlines, it still remains more prevalent than at any point in modern history. But obviously, the system was flawed, and the benefits did not accrue evenly to everyone. And there are things that could be done to make it much better, much more resilient, much stronger for as much of the world's population as can benefit. So the current crisis, in my view, presents an opportunity for the US and its allies to further advance the work that was begun in the aftermath of World War II, and to create an adapted and modernized, more resilient rules-based international system. With cooperation, determination, and resolve, the US and its allies and partners, like Sweden, which has a lot to offer in all of these endeavors, can both limit damage of the virus and recover from the immediate crisis, which obviously is job one, but also do that with an eye toward what does a rejuvenated global system look like? How can we adapt a system and erect new structures and new rules to bring about decades more of future freedom, peace, and prosperity, at least through the middle of this century, 2050. Before turning to the outlines of an ambitious strategy for trying to bring about that scenario, I wanted to cover what I call the 7 key pressure points in the global order that I think are being significantly stressed by the pandemic. And in many ways, once you have these challenges identified, that's what the strategy has to deal with if you're going to fashion a strategy. I'll move through these relatively quickly. I want to get to conversation. And we can talk about them more in the discussion. First pressure point, to me, I am standing here in the Washington, D.C. area, and the U.S. domestic power base itself, which is not just important for the United States, but for the world, it appears to be weakening further from my point of view. The virus appears to be further deepening domestic divisions in our political system and in our society. One of the most important bases for US power in the world. Some of you might have seen the photograph that really caught me a few weeks ago. And I think it might have been in Michigan. It was a picture of a hospital worker blocking protesters who were in their cars trying to block traffic to the hospital. So it was a medical worker in his gear, standing in the middle of the street and blocking a line of protesting cars who didn't want to close down, didn't want to lock down, didn't want to suffer through what we're all suffering from. I think that's the iconic image of this decade, from what I can tell, in many ways like the protester in Tiananmen Square in 1989. So there has already been reputational damage to the United States, and this affects US influence and power in the world. And if outbreaks continue in the US and the economy remains stalled, this is a major problem for the US, but also for a US-led system. Second pressure point for me is the global economy, and obviously with the world's largest economies partially shut down, the world is at risk of a global depression. The more I speak to leading economists and financial leaders, this is not a clear set of outcomes. It is not positive right now. Recovery is likely to be fractured. At this point, it looks like China might recover more quickly. We don't know. We don't know about the data from the Chinese economy, which the Chinese Communist Party puts out, but we do have a sense that this might be an outcome. And if that is the case, and the US and Europe are still mired in openings and closings, this could be a problem. And many economists talk about various shapes of recovery curves: the V-shaped, which is rapid recovery, a double dip recession, which is the W-shape, a more gradual U-shaped recovery. And of course, we all want to avoid the L shape, where there's not much of a recovery. And a lot of people are focused on the developing world, where they already have significant debt burdens and fewer financial tools to deal with these kinds of economic shocks. That could boomerang significantly back into the developed world at minimum. Third, clearly the US-China rivalry is intensifying. Both countries are suffering, but whichever country recovers first and fullest may be in a stronger position to shape the post-pandemic order for decades to come. Indeed, there is the potential for the pandemic to generate a significant shift in the global balance of power. China, though, has suffered diplomatically. As I mentioned earlier, its soft power and global influence have taken a major hit. And I speak to friends in Sweden and elsewhere about this. It suppressed valuable data as the pandemic was beginning in Wuhan in late 2019. It censored and imprisoned those who were warning about it. And it's really undertaken a wide range of hostile diplomatic efforts, not to mention its aggressive military efforts, which are continuing. There were even instances of xenophobia and hostility toward Africans in China that I mentioned has prompted a lot of rebukes from African officials. However, the US also has not stepped into its traditional global leadership role in any way that is being perceived by others. And so I worry a bit too about the risk of armed conflict. It's not imminent, but it is higher than before the crisis, especially if you think about potential misperceptions of reduced US military readiness in the Pacific. We don't want the Chinese military seeing this as an opportunity to advance militarily. A fourth pressure point is Russia. It's weakened. Initially, it seems to have avoided the worst of the crisis. Now it's facing really one of the worst outbreaks in the world. This comes on top of significantly declining energy prices, significantly declining living standards over the last few years. And this could really shake Vladimir Putin's power base. And while NATO's readiness also has suffered, is there a chance that Putin might pursue military adventures to distract from his major problems at home and seek to rally his base? Fifth, the US Global Alliance Network is also being shaken. This includes the core transatlantic set of relationships, and we can go through the reasons why various steps the US took over the course of this crisis without consulting European leaders have not landed well in Europe. And of course, Europe itself is facing some signs of strain. The EU, some countries leaning more closely to China, and obviously struggling economies and some regional blocs forming regarding even the virus itself. In the Pacific, some key democratic allies and partners, Taiwan and South Korea most importantly, have responded in really world-leading ways to this pandemic. We also see New Zealand and Australia doing quite well. However, if China recovers faster economically than the US, we might see a situation where our Asian friends have no choice but to be more economically linked with China for their markets. And that could also have damaging influence. Sixth, international institutions have faltered. Clearly, the virus has affected key pillars of the rules-based system. We could talk about the WHO, the UN Security Council, the G7, the G20. Not much has been done by these institutions. Of course, this is linked to the lack of US interest in leveraging these institutions. Seventh, and finally, democracy and good governance is being challenged. I see the possibility for what a colleague of mine has called a global middle-class rebellion. People are questioning governments' responses to the pandemic. Why aren't they getting what they need from their governments? Protection and jobs. Social contracts are at risk. I actually wrote a paper in April 2015. I was looking at longer range global trends, and I projected that there would be much more restiveness among the world's population for reasons we can talk about afterwards. But I am worried increasingly about the potential for another turn of the populist screw, but also new breeding grounds for extremism, for terrorism. And I think it is a little crazy to say, but even within the United States, will there be more violence across our societal schisms? So with these 7 pressure points in mind, let me just give you a sort of skim of our early thinking about a strategy. But the headline is, the US should work together with its allies and partners to bring about a new renaissance by first mitigating the impact of the virus effectively and seizing the opportunity to sort of skip a generation of steps in democracy, in the economy, in health, and in security to really rejuvenate a new rules-based system for decades to come. In the health area, for example, the US and its allies could work together to lead a recovery by defeating the virus. I have called for organizing what I called a countering coronavirus coalition of like-minded states that will dedicate resources to ramping up testing, identifying treatments and vaccines, supporting one another with vital medical equipment, and also countering what some have called the infodemic, the misinformation about vaccines and other elements of the crisis that have been spread by bad actors. But at the same time, the US and its allies could work to rejuvenate a global public health system, make it more durable, better able to monitor threats, better able to manage crises, and certainly strengthening the WHO is one of those such efforts. We also should try to work with China, as I've written about recently, to prevent and prepare for future pandemics, including dealing cooperatively with China on the unsanitary practices there and elsewhere that led to this virus in its so-called wet markets. An additional idea might be a thought that democracies really thrive on transparency, and transparency is critically important for a global health system. So maybe the creation of a democratic alliance for health that brings together European and Asian allies in a cooperative body committed to health security. Turning to the economy, same general dynamics. First, a recovery, close coordination in the G7, the G20, elsewhere. But this is also a time to consider rejuvenating the global system, making it more resilient to shocks, looking more for inclusive growth, increasing living standards, resisting protectionism, seeking new agreements that promote free and fair trade. Protectionism before World War II did not help and served to help weaken the global economy. Maybe now it makes sense to think about bringing together a free world trade agreement, linking the US, Europe, its like-minded allies that commit to certain trade standards across the world. Even in democracy also, a recovery of our democracy and a rejuvenation of good governance. Maybe there's a next generation of democracy that we should move toward. instead of letting our adversaries weaponize social media to try to weaken our democracy, maybe we can leverage steps that can be taken to secure democracies, exploring how we can use technology to facilitate elections in a time of crisis. Estonia is modeling some of this behavior, so maybe we should look for some lessons from them. And finally, in the area of defense, obviously the US and its allies could do much to make sure that there are no misperceptions by actors who want to be aggressive. We could use diplomacy, we could use focused military activity. But I think the new headline here for me is an analogy to 9/11, and then I'll look to end and have a conversation. You know, the American people lost 3,000 people in 9/11, and counterterrorism then took center stage for almost 20 years. Now we're likely going to lose a lot more life in the United States. Upwards of 150,000 is likely, unfortunately. And so after a much more dangerous security crisis, much more needs to be done together to prevent pandemic threats. And you have to imagine that some adversaries, North Korea and others, will see this and start to try to invest more in biological capabilities as part of their arsenals. So the US needs to look at Silicon Valley and all that great biotech activity that will be driving the future economy in the 2030s. And maybe there are things that can be done within the confines of legal international law, including the Biological Weapons Convention, for the US to stay ahead of these kinds of problems, to incorporate other advanced technologies, artificial intelligence, working with advanced allies like Sweden and like NATO allies to bring all this together. So in ending, the key theme here for me is what I call hyper collaboration among the US and its like-minded allies and partners. I know I've used that term a lot, but it is really one of our greatest assets that we have to secure our way of life, our democracy, our economy and jobs, and our security. Only by leveraging this collective capacity can the United States help to shape a much better world in the aftermath of this crisis, bring about a new renaissance for our people and the global system. This has happened before in history, as I started my talk about, and I think the Scowcroft Center is really trying to help catalyze such efforts, working with all of you in the real world. I don't want to come off as this sounding Pollyannish as we're suffering so much, but I think the art of strategy is, as General Scowcroft once told me, where do you want to go in the future and how do you want to get there? So let's deal with this crisis. Let's limit the loss of life. Let's build a better world when we're all through this. And with that, I look forward to a great conversation.
Thank you, Barry, for those very insightful and I think inspiring remarks of what we actually can do and what we should be doing going forward. I'd like to start the conversation with a couple of questions before we turn to the audience as well. And I'd like to go back to sort of your backyard, national security. As a result of COVID-19, do you think health would be seen like a more important pillar for national strategies, national security strategies going forward? And how will that be embraced by sort of the traditional experts in this field? And will it last beyond the pandemic itself?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's an unknowable question because we're still going through this. At one point, I called this a slow motion 9/11.
Yeah.
As I said at the beginning, we don't know how long this is going to last. I'm seeing wildly varying estimates from scientists. Some saying forever, some saying a few years, some saying next year we'll have a vaccine, or even at the end of the year. So it's really highly uncertain. But I think that there is a role for national security in the future regarding health security. Certainly, there are other parts of all of our governments in Sweden and the United States where health security is mission one, and we've seen a lot of those really talented officials. Thank goodness they're in those jobs, really leading the way on the response. But I also think there's a lot of capability and capacity in these can-do departments in the United States that are part of the national security establishment. And if I'm an American citizen living somewhere else besides Washington, which I'm not, I'm thinking to myself, $700 billion a year for the US military, and what did they do to protect me from this threat? And I am sitting here scared. How can I make this investment pay off as a taxpayer? And there's a lot the military can do, including transport capability, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, command and control of assets, and other things that can be done with really a worldwide network of sensors and capabilities. So I think there's a lot that our military can do, and I would venture a guess that incorporating health security into national security will be a very high priority going forward. Particularly if you think about the downward, the fiscal pressures that are now getting much more significant with the economic relief packages. So I'm not sure if that completely answered your question, but I see a very big priority shift for the reasons that I talked about.
I think partially you are absolutely correct. We're going to have to see those resources and investments being deployed in times of crisis, maybe a little differently than we've had in the past. And we have seen the National Guard being very involved. And you have an event coming up with the National Guard chief to discuss what their contribution as well. So looking forward to that. Going back to more the traditional views of national security and during a pandemic, and we've talked about it at some point, that the pandemic hits various regions a little differently at a different pace. So there's also an exposure of managing your national security in your homeland during a pandemic as well. So my question was also partially directed to that challenge itself.
I see. Yeah, it's very difficult because for a number of reasons, and I'm sure I won't answer it fully. But there are, nothing else in the homeland has diminished in terms of threats and challenges, and so it's not like they can ignore everything else and just now solely focus. And there's also capability questions. A lot of the homeland security capabilities are, focused on particular areas and not broadly applicable. And so, how you think about, homeland security versus national security. What's the roles, missions, and responsibilities? What's the resources and broader security policy and strategy? I think that all has to be thought about in a comprehensive way. I guarantee next year, either the second term Trump administration or the first term Biden administration has to do a strategy review. I guarantee that this will be front and center. And so the question you just asked and these other issues will be comprehensively addressed. And I would love this audience, which is informed, send us your ideas, help us. We're working with all of these parties. We can do this. So I think something I didn't say, which is worth mentioning, I am optimistic. We still have great fundamentals, great values, great human capital, great natural resources. We will get through this if we work together.
Thank you. My last question here kind of turn to the transatlantic agenda and Europe. The agenda has been dominated in recent years about the trade agenda and the lack of progress there, I would say, and some challenges. And also, I think in the national security domain, very much sort of impacted by NATO funding discussion and reaching the 2% target. Even though there has been the European reassurance program as well. So there's been other initiatives, but the trade agenda and NATO funding, which has been sort of challenges. So if you look at the transatlantic relation, but also EU itself, how can EU emerge stronger and healthier from this crisis? Every crisis presents an opportunity here. And clearly EU had its challenges pre-COVID with Brexit and other nations questioning the alliance. So how can EU come out of this crisis stronger and more credible for the citizens?
It's a great question, and I don't consider myself an EU expert, but my sense is that some of the framework that I talked about is also relevant for the EU. And so dealing with the health issues, the economic shocks, making sure the military and security is well attended to, democracy well attended to. I think thinking about all of those at once and in a in an all EU fashion. There obviously is this tendency in this particular crisis to sort of focus on the local. We all are doing that. I'm in my home in the Washington area. We all are, and so it's local and then it's national. And obviously, you see, we saw borders going up towards the beginning, and now we're starting to see what I call sort of travel bubbles. As an example, you're seeing Australia and New Zealand talking about a travel bubble because they're both doing amazing jobs. I saw Germany and Austria talking about opening the border. So why doesn't the EU look to set some standards for all that and to work with countries and spread best practices on the continuing mitigation of the virus impact, but also on how do we think about opening up so that countries that aren't in those direct discussions with countries that are doing very well, like Germany, so that other countries can benefit from similar standards, similar thinking, and maybe even some economic aid that makes some sense. And I know that's a controversial issue, but also health equipment and other aspects of that I covered in my framework. So I think I would consider using an adjusted but similar framework to the one that I outlined in my remarks.
Thank you. We're starting to see some questions filter through from Christian, and maybe I can look at a couple. The first one is sort of related to the question about EU from Harleen Atwell writes, how willing do you think Europe is to cooperate with the US? And do you think Europe will be pressured or threatened by China?
Well, we've already seen a lot of interesting engagement by China in Europe, as I referenced during this crisis. We've seen, them attempt to deliver equipment. I can't say I have a comprehensive reading of what actually has gone on, but I've seen a lot of hiccups, faulty equipment being delivered to Spain. These diplomatic statements that are much more aggressive than we've ever seen before from China. And so I don't think they're, to use the old phrase, winning friends and influencing people at this point. But we do see some pull of some European states in China's direction. We saw some pretty stark statements out of Serbia, for example. And so the question of how Europe, overall might cooperate more with the U.S., I think it is a really important one. But also, the U.S. has a role here where I think we have not, looked to coordinate as much as we should, announcing the shutdown of travel, without consultation. And so, look, consultation to me is pretty easy. And I think we should do a lot more of it. And as you could tell from my remarks, we should do a lot more, coordination on all of these important policies and our strategy. As I said, the U.S.-Europe link is really one of the most important assets that the United States has. And as an American citizen, I know I've benefited from this global network that is really undergirded by our values: the rule of law, open market economies, democracy, et cetera. I think really important. One of my lines that I use sometimes about this question is, if you don't like America first, you're really not going to like China first. Imagine a Chinese-dominated rules-based system. Look at just some of the behavior, the coercive behavior they're using during the crisis. So I think it's really important for the U.S. and Europe to cooperate to deal with this set of issues.
Turn to another sort of related question from a Atlantic Council non-resident fellow. Agus Cole asks, how do you look at the NATO impact of variation in national COVID-19 strategies and post-infection resilience? And might that reduce allied training and collaboration in Baltic and Arctic regions?
Yeah, boy. Also, let me advertise August's latest book. It's called Burn In. If you remember Ghost Fleet, this is the next one. And so he is not paying me, but I'm a huge fan of August Cole. And so great question. and he'll be at the Atlantic Council, actually, I believe June 2nd, talking about the role of fiction and how can we think about it dealing with these kinds of crises. But in terms of the impact on NATO exercises, some countries might be more damaged, other countries less. And so this is an excellent question that is, unfolding. It's raw. I mean, this is a really important set of issues. How can we keep allied training and exercises up in some way to make sure that the signals are sent to potential adversaries who want to use this as an opportunity to advance against NATO and NATO members' countries and territory, in addition to the ongoing disinformation and influence campaigns, which are extremely active right now by Russia and China. And I didn't mention in my speech, but it's important, they're increasingly coordinating, according to the US State Department, on the disinformation issues campaigns. But so, yeah, how do we think about this question, August? This is a very good issue. I think artful messaging, but also some sort of standards for when can units, conduct military exercises of various types. Can we also do command post exercises that still demonstrate some capability? So while your question is a good one, I also think it's a broad one, not just in the Baltics or the Arctic, but we also have to worry about other sort of frontline areas, including the Black Sea region, the Mediterranean, and elsewhere, where we have seen Chinese military forces operating with Russian forces, both in Northern Europe and in Southern. So good question. We have to take that on.
I have another question from Per Mortensson, formerly of the Swedish American Chamber of Commerce in DC. He asks, in the past, soft power has been a great asset, but it has been hurt by COVID-19. What do you think it would take for the US to rebuild in soft power, if possible? Do you think it's possible for China to generate the same kind of soft power that the US has had in the past? So you sort of touched on that a little bit, but maybe you can elaborate a little bit more on that.
Sure, it's a tough and also large question. This is a great audience. All of these questions, please send us your thoughts afterward too. I think, and I'm hearing this from some of my European friends, both countries' soft power has been significantly damaged by this crisis. The US, for obvious reasons, not coordinating. Although I do think the US has done a poor job of even messaging what it has done well. $500 million worth of US aid sent overseas to countries that needed it. Very good coordination by central banks, I think, which is really critically important. And there have been a few other things. But in general, the perception of the US as having fallen down on the soft power job here has really come to the fore, unfortunately. And I think a lot of it too is public statements. If you're allies and the sort of underpinning of all our alliances is values. When it really comes down to it, we want to work with you in military forces because we're protecting the same things. Security, free economies, and the rule of law and democracy. And so if there are public statements from the US that call those values into question, which has happened, that's extraordinarily damaging for publics in allied countries to continue to think that the US and their country are kind of alike and we kind of have each other's back. If that is not the case, then that bond starts to fray. China sometimes says good things. I remember the Davos where Xi Jinping stepped in and said, China's the paragon of climate change, despite the enormous environmental damage that comes out of China every day. But it had some traction. So when a head of state says the right things, that's an important element of this. So public messaging that we're with each other. I think that's very important because I think when you dig one or two levels down from the Chinese public messaging, even when it's relatively benign, that's not the way I think that most of our societies want to organize themselves. I don't think that's what we want. But the U.S. is going to have to start stepping up if it's going to avoid that outcome.
I also think the soft power is really built from bottom up. And if you take the transatlantic relation, the trade relationship is so important and so fundamental in that relationship. And we who are involved with this on a daily basis know actually how well it works in certain areas and how strong it is. And I think public remarks and public perception matters. And I think in some way it erodes many good things that are actually going on in terms of the foundation for the soft power. I want to follow up with one question as well. We haven't really talked that much about Russia and their approach to COVID. I mean, they've been relatively quiet. Russia was really on the forefront in the conversation in Europe in many respects, but in particular from national security. What's your take on their approach around COVID-19 and how they communicate about the challenge itself?
It's interesting. I haven't heard much about that. When there was so little written about it in the first, let's say in March and the first half of April, I was thinking, okay, obviously they're suppressing the problem, and it's probably worse than we're thinking. And then it kind of came out in the open as the virus clearly started to spread much more widely in the Russian system. And I haven't seen that much messaging about it, except I did see the FSB doing its magic and killing doctors and throwing them out windows. Doctors who, similar to Chinese tactics, when you think about it, just a little more open in the Russian system, sadly, where they, any doctor that talks about what's really going on is going to meet with an untimely end. And I have no doubt that was a message to the entire Russian medical establishment to be quiet and do your job. But my sense is it's probably a lot worse in Russia than it even is being messaged. And I wonder, again, as I mentioned in my remarks, what if it continues to get worse? I worry about a bit of a lash out, so that Putin can try to shore up his power base. It's really hard when you look at these authoritarian countries to have a good sense of what's really happening here. I look on the websites where they track all the statistics on the virus, and it's funny, if you do a search on deaths per million, the authoritarian countries are way at the bottom, despite their suffering. So when you see China and Russia with these ridiculously small numbers, despite what you see in the press, and you saw all these horrible pictures of thousands of urns in Chinese mortuaries, there's no way that their numbers are anywhere close. So it really makes you have to be a sophisticated consumer of the messages they are sending out, because it's very clear they are not representing ground truth.
Thank you so much, Barry. I think we're approaching the end of our conversation. I really appreciate all your remarks and your answers on tricky questions. As always, great to listen to you. I'd like to leave a couple minutes for you to a little bit of a wrap up here before we leave today.
Sure. I think that was a really great questions. I would, as I said, we would welcome more. I hope that my remarks give our audience a sense of what a lot of us still in the Washington area, despite what you see on some of the headlines and some of the major media outlets, we still, most of the American people, most of the polling, very much value the transatlantic relationship and the relationship with our like-minded democratic allies in Asia, many of whom are doing so well in leading the world's responses to this unprecedented crisis. So we need you, and I think we can all benefit by working together. But let's think optimistically. We still have the fundamentals, and I really think it's important that we keep that in mind, even as we're suffering, even as we see negative headlines. I think the way democracies tend to deal with these things is the first reactions are always messy and ineffective, and then we recover. We get our stuff together, and then we come out stronger. And so let's all keep that in mind, even as we're dealing with the terrible losses, both in terms of life and in terms of economy and jobs. And let's all work together to get out of this in a much better condition for the next 40 or 50 years. So thanks very much to the Swedish American Chamber of Commerce. Great working with you as always, Mike. And please, everyone, stay tuned to the Atlantic Council, the Scowcroft Center website. And a lot more of this is coming, and we would very much benefit from your views. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Barry.